Hi, everyone, and welcome to Empowering Exceptional Brains, the podcast where we dive into real conversations about neurodiversity, interviewing parents, individuals, and professionals to explore the challenges, strengths, and unique experiences of diverse learners and thinkers. I am your host, Maayan Glazer-Koren, an educational therapist, ADHD educator, and ASD certified specialist. Through my private practice, Educational Therapy LLC, my team and I support kids and adults with executive function and learning differences as they work toward greater confidence and independence. This podcast is a collaboration with Wiz Therapy, a platform that connects individuals with providers and helps businesses streamline their services to better support neurodiverse communities. Our goal is to share strategies, stories, and insights to help families, educators, and professionals understand and empower every kind of learner. A quick note, if you are ever concerned about your or your child's well-being or mental health, please reach out to your doctor or qualified healthcare professional for additional support. In case of emergency, please dial 911. For mental health crisis, please text 741-741 from anywhere in the United States. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Here is a quick disclaimer. The podcast is for informational and educational purposes only. The content shared on this podcast is not intended as medical, psychological, or legal advice and should not replace professional care from qualified healthcare provider or mental health professional. If you have concerns about your or your child's well-being, learning, or mental health, please consult with your doctor, therapist, or another licensed professional. The views and opinion expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect those of the host or the podcast. By listening to this podcast, you acknowledged and agree that neither the host nor guests are responsible for any actions you take based on the information shared. I'm so glad you're here today with us. Today we have a very special guest, speech and language pathologist, Patti Hamaguchi. Patti is the founder of Bright Stars Speech and Language Services, a private practice dedicated to helping children build communication skills in a supportive and engaging way. Patti authored and co-authored several books such as Childhood Speech, Language Listening Problems, What Every Parent Should Know, a metacognitive approach to treating auditory processing problems, and It's Time to Listen. In our conversation, we'll dive into her approach, what families can expect when seeking speech and language support, and some practical tips you can use right away. Patti brings years of experience and expertise and a deep passion for helping kids thrive. And I can't wait for you to hear from her. So, Patti, welcome to our podcast. Please introduce yourself and thank you for being here.
Well, hello. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. I guess I'll just dive right in and tell you a little bit about myself. I actually started out my career as an elementary education teacher. I taught, quote, grade school, and I also had a reading certification and a speech back in the day. It was called the speech correctionist certification in New Jersey, and later went back for my master's degree in speech language pathology. So the first 15 years of my career, I was actually in public schools, in elementary, middle, and high school grades, all of them. And then when I moved to California in 1996, I decided to start a private practice in Cupertino. So I've been in Cupertino since 1996, started out as a sole practitioner, and over time we have continued to grow. And now we have 10 speech language pathologists on our staff, and we just love, as they say, we love what we do. So I'm
So,
happy to be here.
what is the age group that you guys are working with?
At our practice, we specialize in younger children. So we see kids starting from about ages 15, 16 months to age 12. Occasionally, we do work with infants, in particular, infants that have known issues, let's say hearing impaired child, baby with Down syndrome, cerebral palsy, etc. But for the most part, our initial assessments start at somewhere around 16, 17 months.
So how does it look like for you when a client comes over, when a parent is concerned? What are the things that you guys are do like in the initial conversation that you do with a parent?
Well, initially, Kristen White, who is our director of clinical services, and or myself will meet with a parent after getting their paperwork. And we do ask a lot of questions to try to nail down what the nature of their concerns are. So depending on the age of the child, the really young kids, it's going to be generally more about the fact that they're not talking yet, or they're hard to understand, or they may have play or social behaviors that are a little concerning. But if we're thinking about elementary school kids, we tend to get referrals from people who are either seeking services for the first time for their child, uh, and or are being referred to us by either their physician or an educational therapist or a neuropsychologist who has done their assessment already on them. And generally, we ask the parents questions. It's a lot of probing. What is happening that is concerning? And then we put together a customized treatment plan, sorry, a customized testing plan for the child. So if they're describing, let's say, because I know we're going to be talking about this a lot today, about difficulty following directions, let's say, difficulty comprehending what people say, then we're going to be thinking on a number of different levels to try to sort out how much of it might be auditory based, how much of it is language based, how much of it is attentional and distractibility, how much of it might be personality. So there's all those different pieces and parts. And so our assessment process is really going to be trying to tease out the nature of it and how it's manifesting itself. How is it impacting their language development? How is it impacting their ability to sustain maybe attention, talking about narrative tasks like retelling a story or sharing an experience or telling somebody what happened? Can they sustain their attention? Can they keep their focus? And how do they interact quickly with social conversations and jokes? Do they understand idiomatic language and slang and that sort of thing? So, depending on the child's age, we're going to be looking at their academic development, their ability to function in the classroom. And for a lot of our homeschool kids, which we do see a lot of homeschool kids, there are issues that may not really be as apparent in a homeschool environment because of in particular for kids who have auditory processing issues, because of the differences in the demands and how the tasks are structured and the acoustic environment. So we're always looking to see, when is this happening? What conditions is it happening under? And where and when does a child function well? Because we do look at it from a strengths-based approach as well. So we don't want to just know about what are they having troubles with and struggles with. We want to know, what are they doing well? Tell us
Hmm.
about this child. We want to know their personality. What do they like? What are they good at? What are they interested in? What gets them excited? When are they happy? Those are just as important as knowing the things that have difficulty with, because all of those, A, help us be able to develop a rapport with that child because we want to connect with them about something that they're excited about. But it also tells us a little bit about their brain and how their brain is organized. So if somebody comes to us and they say, they really struggle with reading to coding, he hates reading, da da da. But boy, he can put together a puzzle or a Lego or pick apart things and put them back together. He could do that all day long, etc. So that's important information for us to know, is what do they like? What are they good at? And it definitely informs us about how their brain might be organized and how we might start this whole process with them.
Yeah, that's a very good point. We do that too. It's one of the most important things that we do is really build a rapport with a kid. We always say to parents, if we don't have a relationship where kids can trust us, and it's really fun because we learn, about them and we play games with them, then it's going to be very hard to follow up with much so-called a treatment plan, right? Um, I do meet with parents quite often, and one of the things that, and we will dive soon on what is your area and your expertise, but if you can share a little bit of information about sometimes parents don't understand what speech therapists do, and they think maybe it's just for articulation or some kind of stuttering. So if you can share a little bit more where you guys come in and when, and I know you already answered some of it, when a parent should pick up the phone and call you guys.
Well, that's a terrific question. And I think you are absolutely right because the word speech language pathologist or speech therapist, which is what a lot of people, casually call us, does sound like just speech, like we just think about talking. And while we do think about talking and how words are pronounced and stuttering, et cetera, what we do is a lot more complex than that and a lot more expansive. So, for example, we not only think about how words sound and how people produce sounds and words to help them articulate better, we also think about language. That's where that speech language part comes into play. So when we think about language, language is going to have basically two components to it. There's the receptive part, what you understand and what you can process, and the expressive part, which is what you can say. And these days, in particular for our kids who are autistic or apraxic and have other difficulties, what they can say may not be done through spoken language. It may be through an augmentative communication device. We call it AAC. So they may use a combination of that. We call it total communication. So the expressive part can take various forms. Some of the kids, especially when we're thinking about little babies and young kids, in the beginning especially, it might be taking the shape of sign language, not necessarily American Sign Language, but using signs and gestures and finding other ways for them to communicate. It may be using picture supports, etc. So we do the speech, which is the articulation part. We do the language part. The other part that we do is auditory processing. And in particular, our practice, that's one of our areas of specialty is auditory processing, which I know we're going to talk about in a little bit further depth soon. But there's definitely a lot of overlap with auditory processing and language processing, and I'll help try to sort those two out in a little bit. And then the other area that we focus in on is social language, social behaviors, and play. And that starts from the time a child's really young. As an infant and young child in particular, we're thinking about joint attention and joint sharing and joint engagement. And that is a big thrust and a big focus of our intervention with very young children, especially because in order to help them connect with us and communicate and respond to us, they have to first be attending to us and focusing in on us. So that is an area that we look at very heavily with our young children is social engagement and play. So play is how children develop language. If you look at research, and there's plenty of it, it shows you that young children especially, but even through the years, use social opportunities to continue to grow their speech and language skills. So if you're not having to communicate with other children or other people, your language will tend to be very self-directed. I want this, give me that. It's just a person talking at somebody and asking for things. But true communication is reciprocal. I'm going to also listen to you. I'm going to respond to you. And so it all overlaps, right? There's elements of it that can be separated, but there's elements that also overlap. How do we understand gestures? We have a lot of kids who don't really understand facial expressions and gestural communication. And we know that gestural communication and body language is a huge part of how we interpret someone else's intent, right? So are they annoyed? Are they happy? Are they getting frustrated with me? Are they sad? And so it informs you in terms of how you're going to communicate with them. So helping a child understand all of those subtle and unstated social communication rules, the gestures, the facial expressions, the emotions, idiomatic language, non-literal language for our older kids in particular, they can be very literal language listeners. And so we want to help decode all of those kinds of language forms for them so that they can more readily socialize with their peers. And then lastly, I would say for younger kids and kids who have difficulty with speech production in particular, there's elements of feeding and their mouth and their oral postures that we also attend to. Do they drool? Do they have a tongue tie? Do they have a jaw position that might slide to the left or to the right? So there's elements of the physicality of their oral structures that we will tend to, and in a way that encompasses their speech production, but also supports feeding and being able to tolerate different textures and tastes, et cetera, et cetera. And probably the last thing I'll say, which kind of comes under the umbrella of auditory processing and auditory memory, et cetera, is phonemic awareness. And phonemic awareness is an element that we'll talk about a little bit more with auditory processing, where that all fits into not only literacy, but where it fits into language acquisition and communication, as well as auditory processing. But that's roughly, in a quick nutshell, some of the areas that we as speech language pathologists do address during our sessions.
Yeah, thank you. You touched something that it's really important also to me to talk about because when I work with clients, I work on the literacy aspect, and and you mentioned the social skills and communication. Now we have to understand that when a student gets to elementary school level or when they're reading already, I'm not talking about dyslexia yet. We will talk about that too. But when they read in order, to comprehend what they are reading, if they have challenges with maybe expressive language, then they will have challenges understand. Example, or if they have challenges with social skills, right? Like you mentioned, sometimes those nuances that we see in writing, they will miss that. So, for example, it might be more challenging for them to understand maybe some kind of argument that is happening between two characters, right? Or because of that gap that they have. And this is why it is really, really crucial to get that early intervention when parents can. Because this is how it will look on later on in the academics, right? If they need to write a novel, to read a novel, sorry, for high school, and you have some challenges or between the characters, or you need to understand what is the emotion that is going on between the characters. Why is this character feeling this way? So this is really important. And also, the other piece is that, like, it's understanding between the lines what is going on, is to make the inference, which is really the higher cognitive piece when it comes to reading comprehension. And this is where this is where, like, for example, in my case, I will work with the client on that. And I will go to talking with them, right? And do some kind of like activities like that before we go to the reading. So this is really important to understand how it's all come together. I would say that in a perfect world, we will have the SLP in the school works with the reading resource specialists together. Sometimes it's not happening, which is unfortunate. And this is where we're gonna dive into more of like the auditory processing piece and the differences between central auditory processing disorder and auditory processing. But yeah, that's my 2 cents about the challenges with reading comprehension and expressive language when it comes to writing, because this is where, again, this is where I work with a client on their expressive written abilities, And we really work from talking to writing because writing is a way to communicate that follows even more rules when it comes
Right.
to just talking about it.
Right. And so in order for you to do what you're doing, they need to have the semantic organization and the underlying
Right.
comprehension of maybe plot sequence, chronology, reference, right? Referencing somebody back. And as you said, at its core, understanding the nature of the different interactions between characters and the situations. If you're thinking about reading comprehension, and even responding to questions about it, right? So
Hmm.
it definitely overlaps. So our piece of it is really more at the cerebral level in terms of the
Right.
understanding and comprehending those elements. Yours is getting them onto paper and helping them be able to take take content and make sense of it.
Right.
How do you take that and make sense of it? We tend to do more in the oral language, the spoken language processing and the spoken language communication. And yours is more in terms of the reading comprehension and the writing. And they all rely on having the content to draw from. So our job is to try to get that content in there so that you have it to draw from.
I do have a question. I know I'm gonna kind of throw it at you, the ball, your court. Get it? Okay. So I do have like, I'm really interested. How many kids do you see early on that there is a challenge with the phonemic awareness and this the school or the neuropsychology was talking about, okay, let's send you to OG specialist, Orton Gillingham, to our listener, or kind of a dyslexia specialist. Uh, and then when they see the child, they notice those challenges with phonemic awareness, which, I did that before. I was an Orton Gillingham. I'm Orton Gillingham trained. And I remember, talking with the kids about moving their mouth in a specific way or the tongue, where the tongue is when you say some sounds. So this is where I see there's a lot of overlaps also when it comes to that piece. And how much of it do you guys take from the oral piece to the written piece and connect it to the letters in the alphabet?
Right. Well, in our case, we tend to do much of it in terms of the listening part and the spoken part and sounds and identifying sounds. We we introduce letters, but we don't, as speech language pathologists at our practice, and I would say that's probably true for most practices, don't go quite as far as I'm going to teach you how to read. But we do associate, like if we're doing the sh sound and differentiating it from the s sound. Let's say we have a child and the word is shoe, and the child says, I can't find my shoe, shoe. And so we're going to do some auditory discrimination with Sue versus shoe from an auditory point of view, right? So we may have a character that we name Sue. This is Sue, right? This is a shoe. Now I'm going to say one of them and I'm going to see if you can really listen. So what we do is we take something that might be fast, let's say like a sound, a B and a P, those are quick sounds, a big pig, right? They go by very quickly, or even short vowels are another one that are very difficult for kids to hear the
Hmm.
differences with. But we do what you guys do. We drag it out and we give them a lot more time to hear and process it. And we do assign, depending on their age, we may assign a gesture to it. So
Hmm.
it may be if we're trying to do M versus N, we might have either a picture or a gestural sign like a versus sound. That's an M versus N. I don't know how clear that is on audio, but I made an M and an N. So we initially try to have gestures and physical representations or or a visual, like a tire leaking air for S, or a snake for an S. So we might even call it a snake sound. And here's why we do that. Because for a lot of kids that we see, their auditory memory and their language is also impaired. So when we try to teach letter sound relationships while we're still trying to get auditory discrimination, adds another layer to it. So to say it's a snake sound, snake is something they're familiar with, and it doesn't require symbolic memory. So eventually, on our snake card, we'll have the letter S. And so we can start making that association. The snake sound is the S sound, but now they don't have to learn them both at the same time. You know what I'm saying? So we break it down into steps. So the auditory step and then the letter sound step. But after that, we generally refer to a reading specialist or an educational therapist, such as yourself, to really dive deeper into the decoding part. There are some SLPs who specialize in it. And I think I mentioned I used to be a reading consultant. So
Right.
back in the day when I had a full caseload, I actually did do that because I like doing reading. But my current staff that is not their area of expertise. So they go as far as the auditory component as it relates to speech, as it relates to auditory processing, assigning a letter to it, letting them see it, and then we pass it along to folks like yourself.
That's neat. Thank you for sharing that. And again, this is why it's so wonderful to have like, a big puzzle of all of us coming together to support a client.
Yep, that's right.
Okay. So I have a question. What led you specialize in auditory processing as a speech and language pathologist, and how does this area intersect with language disorders? So now we're going to dive a little bit more
Okay.
inside.
All right, sure. So I will tell you, I know exactly how and when my interest developed. So I'm glad you asked that. So way back in the late 80s, when I was working in an elementary school in Connecticut, I had a student, I even remember his first and last name, but I'm not going to share it. I had a referral for this child from a very sharp teacher, one of my favorite first grade teachers. She didn't refer kids without having really good justification. And she said, I've had this kid and we've tested his hearing. The nurse has tested his hearing multiple times, and his hearing is fine. Um, and he's bright. Like there's all kinds of things that he knows about and can talk about, and he's got a great personality, and he's really friendly, and he's wonderful. And there's something not quite clicking with him. So they started it with a psychoeducational assessment by our learning disabilities consultant and the psychologist. And lo and behold, other than some phonemic awareness issues, but he had taught himself to read with visual, right? Like visually, so
Mm,
memorizing patterns. So
hmm.
technically at that point, he was actually kind of on grade level, or just maybe, a little bit weaker, but okay. So he didn't really fall into a range of needing academic support in reading. And when we had our meeting, they said, his IQ, he's solid. In fact, he's on the higher end of average. He's a bright kid. But he is asking a lot. What? What did you say? And sometimes we would say something and he would repeat it back the wrong way. And we're like, no, that's not what I said. And then when they were following directions in the class and the teacher was giving instructions, after they were going to lunch, he would say, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. I don't understand what I should do. Or he would start doing it during class and it'd be completely wrong. He completely missed the entire point of the instruction. And yet when the classroom teacher would sit with him at lunch and say, all right, let me show you this, she was like, he picks it right up. Like he's got it. But when he's in the classroom, he was struggling. And this is not a child who had attentional difficulties. He had no symptoms of inattentive type ADD, ADHD, nothing. He was actually quite attentive from the face of it. He certainly seemed like he was attentive, and they really didn't know what to make out of it. So they passed him to me and they said, could you look at his receptive language, his auditory comprehension? At that point, this is kind of a sidebar, but the test that we use for auditory comprehension was called the TAPS, Test of Auditory
Hmm.
Processing Skills, the TAPS. And I am now actually the co-author of the fourth edition, but all the way back then I was using it as a user. So that's why I think I knew what I wanted to change about it, but that's getting off track. But anyway, on that test, he did show that he didn't quite catch everything. He missed questions, questions that were who, what, where, when. He would answer the wrong question. He would forget different things or misinterpret things. And it was difficult for him to do it. And we did find that after lunch, as the day wore on, he would sit and he would put his head down like he was tired, like he was
Mm.
just really, really tired. And so I recognized that I was a little bit in over my head and that something wasn't quite adding up because his language scores per se were strong. They were okay on paper. He looked good, but it wasn't happening that way in real life. So there was a guy at Southern Connecticut State University by the name of Bob Jersa, Dr. Bob Jersa. And Bob Jersa had pioneered a program in auditory processing for children in particular. And I had heard about it because I had gone to some seminars and things. And he was taking kids at the university to do assessments on. So I said to the parent, I'm not sure. I think he may have this. He may have this auditory processing problem, but I don't have the tests for it. I don't have the background. I don't know what I would do for it, but I feel like we should rule it out. So they took him there. They did the testing, and he was at the first percentile on almost all of the auditory processing
Ooh.
tests. And it was like there, bingo, we finally found what was happening with this kid because everything looked so rosy on paper otherwise. And to his credit, Bob Jersa, who really, and God rest his soul, he's no longer with us, but he really wanted uh, people to know what to do. He wanted SLPs to know what to do. So one of his core functions was to impart that information. So he sent me a packet with by step instructions of what to do with this child. Start here, do this, do this, do that. And it was all stuff that I had never seen. I had never seen it published. It was working on the syllabic level of ba, da, ka, ga, and a whole hierarchical sequence. And that was something that had never really been taught to me in school or I had ever seen. He also had me working on different levels in terms of adding pauses and slowing down what I was saying and working on building up this child's ability to hear and process speech at a faster pace and a faster rate. So that was in the late 80s. I think it was 1988, 1989. So I started going to different seminars and things. Dr. Frank Music, Gail Shermack, Jay Lucker, all these innovators in the field who at that point we didn't have online, courses and stuff. You had to go to it. So I made it my business to go find them, seek them out, and learn from them and read their books and uh, not only adapt, what they're doing, but take it and put my own little spin on it, which I eventually did. But that's how I started, was with this one particular child. And that's what started the whole interest in this topic.
Isn't it amazing? It's always come from a personal experience. I think I don't want to talk for everybody in our area of expertise in our profession, but I have to say that everybody I speak with, um, I think 90% of people I talk with, it's a personal.
Yeah, there's a
Um,
story. There's a story. Yeah.
there
Yep.
is always a story. I mean, I come to this profession because of my kid, from other people, other kids that I met as a teacher, so it always come from a very personal place, as teachers or as parents of.
Yeah.
You mentioned something really interesting, about the auditory processing piece and the phonological awareness. I'm thinking because, when the kids go to preschool or TK in kindergarten. This is where we start with this kind of starting with literacy, right? This is where we start. And what are your experience? Do teachers, I don't know, I don't think the teachers get this type of deep understanding of how it looks like and when it will be a red flag. I mean, the kiddo you shared the experience with was very lucky that you were there and that he had a teacher that said, oh, that's a red flag, right? So this is my main even concern, in the education system is do we have, maybe a class or case studies that teachers can look at when they're getting their, teaching cert credentials about what to look for. And also, I'm trying to be also realistic because I'm thinking out loud here with you because they have 20 something kids in the class and you have to be able to tease it out. Now, today you have the iReady, and I know that they're doing those screening as well. Um, yeah, just a thought.
Yeah, well, and I think too, in terms of how phonemic awareness impacts kids, even above and beyond literacy, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if we think even at the lower level of phonetactic input and storage in our language centers, because that's how we learn words, that's how we store them, that's how we retrieve them. For even forget about literacy, but even before we get to there,
Right.
right? So these are kids who have a lot of times overlapping issues with word retrieval and slow processing in terms of how to
Right.
respond. So somebody asks them a question, it takes them a little while to answer because their storage, if you will, of words is a little hard to access because it's not organized well. I always tell people to picture, well, younger people may not, but people who are older will picture in libraries, we used to have these card catalogs, right? You'd pull
Mm-hmm.
out a drawer, this big long drawer, and it was all organized. And it was organized in some cases by the author. Another one was organized by the topic. Another one was organized by the title, etc. There's all these different cross sections of ways that you can organize stuff. But in the case of vocabulary and new words, if we look at how the brain functions and how it inputs new words, it's by multiple repetitions of hearing it. And so for a typically developing child, you're looking at about 6 repetitions and exposures of them hearing it. But for children who have word retrieval problems, we're thinking about 20 exposures. And so, and for some of our kids who have profound speech and language difficulties, it could be 50 or even 100 exposures before that word is really inputted and stored in their lexicon. And how you store it is phonetically. So the example I like to give people is, if let's say you meet a new person at a party, right? Somebody you know it's their spouse or their boyfriend or girlfriend, and hey, here's Vanessa. Oh, nice to meet you. Da, da, da. And you go home, and the next day somebody says, oh, who did they bring? And you might go, oh, I can't. And they'd say, well, was it Anne? And you'll go, no, no, it wasn't Anne. No, was it Jill? No, no, but definitely it was like Veronica, Victoria, Virginia, and then was it Vanessa? Oh yes, it was Vanessa. Because when that's inputted, your brain categorizes it by length, by syllables, by initial sound. And so instinctively it was definitely not Mary, it was definitely not Anne, definitely not Paula. It was one of these other things, right? We recognize that. So even if we don't, even with one exposure, we have a very light imprint of it, a very light imprint, but it's still there, but it's phonetic. And so if I have a child who struggles with phonemic awareness and hearing sounds and ordering sounds and comparing sounds and discriminating similar sounds, hearing Vanessa versus Victoria versus Virginia requires many different uh, exposures to it. And if they have short-term auditory memory issues, then they really need more. And they also need to have visualization strategies to hold on to things. So it impacts their expressive language by needing extra time to collect and organize and express themselves. So those kids you might hear, he was saying that that's a kid who's not really stuttering per se. It's not a stutter, but it's a disorganized kind of language output. And when you have an ADHD component on top of it, which oftentimes we do,
Mm-hmm.
we have all this neural static kind of trying to push them off that neural pathway of expressing that, but it's hard to access that. So we see that manifesting itself from the word go with kids trying to put together expressive vocabulary. So when I see kids using words that are similar but not spot on from the time they're little, uh, messing up somebody's name, somebody's name is Jennifer and they call them Juniper, they call them this, they call them that, and you correct them and tell them, and they still get it mixed up. And a girl named Sarah is Susie and this and that. You see it mostly on names. That's a big telltale sign. But it's that speed of processing the names and articulation patterns. And so you see these subtle differences with Sue and Shu. And just as we were talking earlier about, K's and G's and the titty tat for a kitty cat, because they can't store and hear that. They can physically say it, but their brain isn't really discriminating those sounds. So we start seeing it with articulation issues. Early on, we see it with the way they're expressing themselves. We see them having confusion with things like names or places, etc. And then we start seeing it with literacy, right? So that those are all the preliminary little red flags that we look for as well. So teachers probably don't have that information. When I was working in the school district, I was always having these kinds of mini seminars. But to be frank, the limitations with public schools these days is that they're so overwhelmed with the
Mm-hmm.
numbers of students who have rather severe language issues. The kinds of kids that I'm describing are very easy to miss, and on their tests probably wouldn't come out low enough to qualify for services because they're really looking to see how does it impact their academic performance. So if they're getting by sight reading and memorizing words, if they're getting by and maybe their expressive language is weak but not very, very disordered, when they're looking at 75, 100 kids on their caseloads, and a lot of them are minimally verbal or barely able to communicate, those kids are often, how can I say, they don't want to see them. They don't want to have to test them. They don't want to have to make a decision about services because their impairment may not be as significant as some of the other children they have. So even as I was easing out of public school, there was sort of this, well, we don't want to see it if we don't want to have to add more kids to your caseloads because we're already maxed out. So, we kind of don't want to know is the bottom line sometimes.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think the caseload is very, very high. Um, I have friends working in, as reader resource specialist, or I have a friend right also, she's SLP. So I'm like, they have so many kids on the caseload. One of my friends is a educational psychologist, and she said that she has 70 to 80 students on her caseload. This is a lot. It's very overwhelming. And I think the rate of burnout is also really, really high, especially after COVID. We see more. Again, this is a sidebar. It's amazing that you were talking about what parents should look at. And this is going to lead us to the next question. But before we go there, while you were talking right now, I had I think in my mind, I was thinking about 3 or 4 clients that, I was like, oh my gosh. And I know that I referred to, but also the understanding that sometimes, and yes, they were missed. They were not given services in school. Definitely not for speech and language. So this is where I refer outside, like to you and to other of my colleagues. What it's really also interesting is that many of this, you have to tease it out. And this is also get us to our parents and, the unfamiliar with this, or maybe and you mentioned that too, that the kid is ADHD. The kid might be autistic as well, and ADHD autistic, and have some auditory processing challenges on top of that. And this is where it's really challenging to tease it out. Is it the ADHD, right? Um, I'm also thinking about when a kid says what, or then they will wait, or the processing speed of what you are saying. They need time to process what you're asking. And you need time to wait for them to produce the language to reply to you. And sometimes they are, well, if they're ADHD, they might miss it. They're like, it's gone. And it's like, what? What did you just say? Right? This kind of response. Um, so this is where, I'm thinking about this too, like for as educators and parents that unfamiliar with auditory processing, and this is our second question is, what are the key signs to look out for? And I know you mentioned some of it, and how they might affect the learning and behavior
Mm,
of that, I don't know, child, teen in the classroom and at
sure.
home.
So I would say we'll go over the key signs. And the other thing that I would say that's important to think about is the co-occurring conditions, because the part of your brain that does auditory processing lives in the same neighborhood as ADHD, as dyslexia, as word retrieval issues, as phonemic awareness. Um, it's all in the same little neighborhood. So even with sensory processing disorders, right? When we think about kids who have hypersensitivity to
Mhm.
unexpected noises or very specific noises, or being able to attend and process when there's a lot of background noise, all of that overlaps. Like if you had a little map of somebody's frontal cortex, you could just see like all of this overlap. And it's very, very rare, if ever, that you have a child who just has ADHD or
Mhm.
just has dyslexia or just has sensory processing disorder because it all overlaps. And so I would say the first thing that I would think about is if you're seeing that constellation of presentations, that should be something you just by nature kind of want to rule out, maybe, especially if you have it paired with some of the symptoms. And so that's the second part. So the known conditions or the suspected conditions will sort of point you in that direction as well. Like, oh, you might also have this going on, as well as autism spectrum disorder, right? So all of that lives in the same wheelhouse. But from a more practical point of view, in terms of what it might look like, especially someone who has more of a disordered presentation versus just a weak presentation. And here's another little sidebar, is even just the term auditory processing and or CAPD, central auditory processing, means different things to different professionals. So I
Right.
should probably start by even clarifying that a little
That would be
bit
great.
so we have a common language. So audiologists um, have two governing bodies in the United States. One is the American Speech Language Hearing Association, also known as ASHA, and they also have the American Academy of Audiology, also known as AAA. And both of those bodies have similar but slightly different approaches to this. So AAA refers to it as APD, auditory processing disorder, and the American Speech and Hearing Association, who speech language pathologists are licensed by in the state, but also on a national level through ASHA, and audiologists, they refer to it as CAPD. ASHA believes that you shouldn't diagnose it until age 7 and up. AAA audiologists believe you can diagnose it much earlier, like age 5, and sometimes even earlier than that, if you have enough substantiation and testing, etc. So you have two different bodies that sort of dictate to audiologists some of the testing issues and the interpretation of those tests and what defines a disorder. And then in the state of California, we also have a licensing board, right? The Speech Language Hearing Licensing Board also has guidelines. And I was the chair for the California task force through the California Speech Language Hearing Association. We had a task force. We developed guidelines for speech pathologists and audiologists. I chaired that some years back. And I don't know if they're still being used by the licensing board, but they were for many years. They may still be. So you have different sets of criteria and different tests. And then on top of that, we have this other issue. And that is that learning disabilities professionals, such as a neuropsychologist or educational therapist or learning disabilities teacher or special education teacher, lay people or those professionals may use the term auditory processing to mean what we in our field refer to as receptive language or auditory comprehension, which is essentially, do they comprehend what they hear, right? That's what they're talking about. But audiologists are talking about the neural pathway from the ear, from the sound that is perceived, and its transmission and arrival at the station in the frontal lobe. And does that information arrive at the station intact? So is the person processing accurately what was heard, or are they processing a different speech input than what was intended? Because if you're processing the wrong information, the issue is not the frontal lobe and the language processing, it's the neural pathway, it's getting there. So if you think about it as being more of a hearing impairment, right? So if we think of children who have mild hearing impairments, which essentially is what CAPD or APD is perceived as by audiologists and speech pathologists, it's saying, I didn't hear what you said the way that you intended for it to be heard. Either it was because it was too fast and I couldn't process it to get there, or there was distortion, or my discrimination wasn't good, but I can't process something I didn't hear well. It's like if I said, the boy ate the dog because it was very hungry. If I could say that louder for you, the dog ate the dog because it was very hungry. Saying it louder doesn't help because the problem isn't the decibel level, the problem is the clarity. The clarity is not accurate. So it's not the language processing, it's the language isn't even identified correctly. So auditory processing in this regard is not the same as auditory processing of language. Those are honestly two separate and overlapping things. And so as speech pathologists and audiologists, we're looking to find out where that issue is occurring. Is it the input and arrival at the station is not happening accurately, or is, yeah, I heard it. I know exactly what you said. I can repeat it back. I can tell you what you said. I don't know what it means. Now we're talking more about visualizing and conceptualizing and assigning meaning to vocabulary that maybe I'm not familiar with, or language forms or passive tense or negation or something, and I don't know what those things mean. It's the content, it's content driven, whereas auditory processing is pathway driven and speech sound signal. So for us, we're wanting to know where each part of that is. So you mentioned earlier about somebody who has trouble hearing fast speech, right? So that would be auditory processing, because it's not about the content, it's about the processing speed and the rate of it. So there's one subtest on the scan test, scan C, that you have headphones on and the person hears a sentence spoken with no gaps and no spaces between the words. So it might be like, the cat ate the mouse, like very, very fast. And the child has to say what they heard. Now, if you're doing testing right and you know what you're doing, the first thing you want to do is see if they can repeat that back in quiet. at that same level in terms of the number of syllables and the length of the sentence, because you need to know that in quiet, when it's normal, that child is able to repeat that back, no problem. We want to know now that we speed it up, is there a difference? And when you're doing auditory processing testing, you're also testing the ears. So you're going to have it in the left ear, you're going to have it in the right ear, and you're going to compare. So sometimes the right ear might be uh, stronger than the left, which is a normal process. It's normal to have a stronger right ear, especially in a young child. That changes over time as they age, that gap narrows. But in a younger child, there is a bit of a gap, and the right ear has a much stronger advantage. But we want to see. So when you hear the cat ate the mouse and it sounds like the cat ate the mouse, what do you think it said? Now, sometimes you'll hear a child say, the cat ate the house. And then you'll think, even if you didn't hear that last word, we call this auditory closure.
Right.
Could you make a reasonable guess as to what that word might be? And it's really quite interesting because I can have two children who have identical scores, right? They might miss this, miss that, whatever. But one kid is really close and their answers make sense. And another one might be the cat bait the mouse. The cat bait the, or the cat take the mouse or something, and it doesn't even make sense because they can't make that slight little leap. If you think about it when you're in a noisy restaurant and you're with friends, or if you're on a phone call in your car and the signal is kind of cutting in, cutting out,
Mm-hmm.
cutting in, cutting out, and you're getting bits and pieces of it, right? Like the person sitting next to you is saying, yeah, we're going next Saturday. Maybe you missed the first part of it, but Saturday, it's a day of the week. They're just telling you when they're going. It's not Friday, it's not Tuesday. Even though I didn't hear the whole thing, I'm going to guess it's Saturday.
Mm-hmm.
It's effortful. It's tiring because you're doing a lot of that auditory closure, like, and maybe using visual supports to look at their lips, but you can fill in the blanks. But we have kids who miss one little tiny little element of a sentence and they are lost. And the
Mm-hmm.
other thing that they will do is they'll say, I have no idea. I have no idea what they said. And you
Mm.
say, can you guess like a little bit of it? I don't know what they said. And so these are the kids who, again, they may have similar scores, but their emotional response and psychological response can be very different. And so that kid who I have no idea what they said is the kind of kid who's going to start tuning out. They're
Yeah.
the ones who I can't even begin to play with this. I don't know what's going on in this classroom. Let me think of what else I could do. Maybe I can get some laughs. These are kids who might not want to seem stupid, right? I don't want to come across like the teacher calls on me. So I'm going to say something goofy and get laughs because it's easier to be the funny kid than be the stupid kid. And so there's all these little pieces and parts that you kind of want to be a bit of a detective about and try to figure out what's going on with the behavior, the presenting behaviors and the personality and the dynamics of the classroom and why the child is reacting the way they are.
That sounds so tiring to have this and sit in a classroom
Yeah,
and frustrating. And I can already see like how it affects the emotional piece
yeah,
and how it can affect social interactions.
right.
They might miss what their friends are saying. How is it can affect maybe even watching a movie?
Exactly. They often do. And a lot of the kids and adults we know, because it does run in families. There is a genetic component to it, not all the time, but a lot of the times the parents will say to me, I always have to have the captions on TV because I can't get everything that they're saying. And in particular, if somebody has an accent, an unfamiliar accent, like British, there's some British,
Mm-hmm.
TV shows or whatever that are very funny. Even I sometimes, if I go to a movie, I'm like, I'm missing some of it. They have a strong Irish accent. What did he say? And I'm bugging my husband or my sisters. What? When somebody has a heavy accent, it is harder to catch it because you have to make that adjustment, that phonetic adjustment in your head that this is what this word is. So kids who have teachers who are soft spoken in particular. I had one teacher many years ago who I always got referrals for. And I went into her class and she stood, at the front of the classroom. She had the kids all sitting there and she talked like this and da da da. And she would say they're not paying attention, they're not listening, he doesn't follow. And then the next year, they were in a class with a teacher who was a former PE teacher, and she had that class in the palm of her hand. And I'm going to describe what we're going to do. And not one of those kids had the same problems because the presentation style was such that it was clearer and easier for them to hear. And so the input of who is talking to them is very important in how their speech sounds. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. I will be like, what? What did
Yeah.
you say?
Yeah.
Um, so we are kind of getting kind of close to finish up, but what will be practical tips that you can share with parents? Let's say the kid is APD or they suspect APD. Yes, they are reaching out to evaluation.
Sure.
At
If
home, what to do because the kid is not following what I'm telling him to do.
Yeah, yeah. So the main things that we tell people is to try to consider that this child has a form of a very mild hearing impairment. They really can't hear you. And if you think about the main issues that impact a child with a mild hearing impairment, it's when there's background noise and people talking over them. So if you are trying to have a conversation and you're sitting in the front seat of your car and the car engine is going and the child is sitting behind you, your voice is actually going straight to the windshield and then getting reflected back to that child. And there's an amount of reverberation and distortion that naturally occurs. So while you're saying it even maybe loudly, maybe, that sound is not reaching that kid's ear the way you think it is. It is sounding a little bit like this, and they have the background noise on top of it layered. So the speech signal is a little distorted, and then we have the ambient noise of the stuff that's going on outside the car and the wind, and maybe a kid kicking the seat next to them, or if they have the music on the stereo or talk radio or anything, that child is not going to be able to hear. And so the location and the nature of the acoustic environment is critical for when they want to impart information. Don't have the dishwasher going. Don't try to talk to them while the faucet is running and you're washing dishes. Don't talk to them while the TV is on and think it's going to go in. They cannot hear and process and input auditory information that way. You need to have them close physically. I would recommend about a foot to 2 feet. The proximity to the person speaking is critical. A foot to 2 feet. That's about where you want to be. 3 at the most, but presumably closer. So the speech signal doesn't have time to disperse and get distorted a little bit and bounce off of different surfaces, etc. So close, have them make sure they're looking at you. Just wait until they do, so they can also use your mouth as a cue for sounds. But the other thing is to break the information down into smaller pieces. Don't just keep going on and on and on.
Mm-hmm.
Take pauses, give time to process. And as you probably guessed from me talking today, I'm from New Jersey. I'm a Jersey girl at heart, and I talk way too fast. And I work with kids who have speech language processing delays or auditory processing. I have to force myself every minute of the session to inhibit that impulse that I have because I want to just talk, but I can't. So I'm going to tell you how you might want to talk. You don't want to slow it down and distort it like this, but you want to speak loud enough and have sufficient pausing so that the child can hear what you're trying to say and be able to think and process what it is. So doing quick checks instead of saying something for 10 minutes, say a little something and do a quick check. So are we clear on what day you're going to be going to soccer practice? Yes, Mom. Well, what was it? Friday. That's right. So you're going to do some repetition. That's right. It's Friday. First, you're going to go here and then blah, blah, blah. So you're going to do some, probing and checking as you go. But the third and most important thing is to write it down. And if the child is not a good reader, draw. Draw
Mm-hmm.
it, and whatever way you can involve the child in the writing down and visual support is best. So if I'm trying to get this child to remember that Friday after school you have soccer practice, we need to have a way to put down Friday. And if the child isn't reading yet, put a little frying pan. This is the Friday, maybe, and they probably will know the number four, Friday at 4. And then you draw a little soccer ball, put that on the refrigerator, but have them involved. Here, you color that. What color should I make that number for? Here, you pick. Do you want me to write it or you write it? Okay, get the child involved, whether it's picking the color, doing this, doing that, but everything should be drawn, written down, and kept for their reference rather than requiring them to remember it in their head.
We do that a lot with executive functioning
Yeah,
support as well, because of, the auditory memory piece.
right.
Um, so I'm like, everything needs to be written down, draw it, and then, right, and have it, I like to call it in your face approach. It's in your
Yeah,
face.
yeah,
So yeah.
absolutely, absolutely. And like we said, it all comes together, right? Aspects of auditory memory, of the processing piece of it, of the language element of it, of the attention span. All of that comes together to help get the information in and get the information out. Yep.
I know we didn't have a lot of talk about executive functioning. I would like to have you here again for that too, in auditory memory. But like you said, these two go together like, two peas in a pod. And
Exactly.
and the strategies are similar, like how we work. I have my own spiel about executive functioning and how it became a buzzword and not really understanding how it affects also organizing language and challenges that students have in middle school, high school. So this is where I see them with organization and organizing the language for writing, but also for producing language. And this is something we can talk about in a different time. Your last 2 cents. What would be a call to action? How can people reach out to you if they have question? Anything you want our audience know?
Sure. Well, they can always contact us at our office. It's office at brightstarsspeech.com. And we're in Cupertino. We do have occasional information nights. We have an online Q&A informational session for free that's on August 25th from noon to 1 for parents of toddlers and preschoolers. We expect to have another one for parents of homeschoolers in September. Uh, Date to be determined. I forget what that is, but we have a date for that. But they can always come and they can always talk to us. We do offer free 15-minute consults with parents if they have questions or just want to, find out a little bit more about our services or what, an assessment might look like for their child or referral to a professional that might be appropriate for them. But I would suggest that they read up, that they talk to some professionals and maybe just think about their child in different ways. And, the kids are generally doing the best they can with what they have. And,
Absolutely.
none of these kids want to disappoint parents or teachers or have people frustrated with them or do poorly in school. every child wants to do well. And so sometimes the behaviors that people see might lead them to think otherwise, but usually the difficulties are there first. And then the behaviors are a reaction to trying to cope with something that's a struggle for them. So yeah, it's always important to kind of dig down and dig below and try to see what's going on.
Yeah, you're preaching to the choir. We say the same thing.
Yeah.
So just
Yep.
not just think a lazy kid.
Yeah. No. Yeah. No.
Betty, thank you so much.